Well, this is Grape Video 42, Vineyard Site Selection, Part 4, Soil Factors. The most important physical factor when choosing a vineyard site within a viticultural region is topography. And we went over that in detail, great detail, in videos 39 and again in video 40, where we showed you the valley and all the ways that topography influences the temperature regime of a vineyard site. Well, it turns out that topography is not the only factor that affects the quality of a vineyard site. So we're going to say in this video that the second most important physical factor when choosing a vineyard site within a viticultural region is soil. Oh yes, soil is so very important, and we're going to talk about many things that have to do with soil in the vineyard in this video. Here we are in the valley that we went over in great detail in video 41. So maybe you'll recognize this particular location from that video. So here we are up on the hillside in this little valley in southwest Michigan. And we look down in the valley bottom, that nice big open field. And this area is a beautifully well-drained sandy loam soil, as it was fitted out to be planted in the spring. This area is also a sandy loam soil, but you can see the dark character of it means that it's the low spot in that field, and it accumulates more organic matter in the soil. Now, if soil were the most important factor in planting a vineyard, that's where the vineyard would be. It would be down in that area because there's just gorgeous, well-drained sandy soil that is perfect for a vineyard. But we know from video 41 that we don't plant a vineyard down there because the topography is the deciding factor when planting a vineyard, not the soil. So we plant the vineyard up on the hillsides for all the reasons we went over in videos 40 and 41. So let's start by saying the most important soil factor now when choosing a vineyard site is not soil chemistry. No, it's not soil chemistry. So very many times over my many years in vineyards, people would come to me and say, I have bought a property. Where can I get a soil test to determine what I need to do to the soil? And that was their very first priority. They wanted to know about the soil chemistry. Well, that's important, and we're going to get onto that. But it's not the very most important soil factor when choosing a vineyard site. No, not by a long shot. It is internal drainage. Internal drainage, what do you mean by that? That means how well water drains through the soil. Is it an open, well-drained site, or is it a waterlogged site? We're going to go over that in great detail. And it is internal drainage in the soil complex that is so very important, even more important than the chemistry of the soil. Well, here we are at my home in the kitchen, on the kitchen counter, and my wife likes to have a jar of basil or basil, if you will, sitting in the kitchen, and she puts sprigs of it in a jar of water like this to have fresh basil right in the kitchen through the summer. And after a while, look what happens. It roots. Yes, it roots. And I used to have an Aunt Agatha who used to grow African violets by the hundreds. She would propagate those. Each leaf she would pull off, put in a little water, and it would start roots in the water. There are other things that root in water, like English ivy. Some plants can develop roots sitting in water just like this. Not grapevines. Oh no, oh no. Here we are in our laboratory with a bucket of grape cuttings, if you will, and we put those in there to force the growth just to see how many of the buds would push out and be alive. But if you do this, yes, they'll push and they'll start to grow shoots, but you will never, ever, ever see roots developing down in that bucket in the water from grapevines, because grapevines just don't like to be standing in water, and they won't root, and the roots won't penetrate the soil when it's waterlogged. It will not happen. Try this yourself if you have some cuttings. Put them in water, force the growth, and you will never see roots developing on the bottom of these cuttings. So out in the vineyard, when we have a waterlogged soil, this is a heavy, heavy clay soil. And you can see the ice patch behind the vine where the water's been sitting. And this vine is struggling. It's been winter killed back. The older trunks, we're bringing up 3 renewal canes to replace it. But it's an old vine that struggles for existence in this heavy waterlogged clay soil. And here's another vineyard, and you can see in the background an area where there's almost no growth of vines. Why? Because that's a heavy, wet, waterlogged soil area, and the grapevines just won't perform there. When we have waterlogged soils, not only won't grapevines grow well, but they'll be more prone to winter injury. They'll be more prone to the development of crown gall on trunks like this. So we really don't want to establish a vineyard on a poorly drained vineyard soil. Here we are. This was many years ago. That water that you see there is what has been filled in on the tracks of the grape harvester as it went down the row, and it sits there. Why? Because it's a heavy soil and it doesn't drain well, and this is a real deficiency in a vineyard site. Oh, and we showed you this when we took the valley tour in video 41. Here is a vineyard that's about 8 years old. It is now abandoned, and one of the reasons it was abandoned was this heavy, heavy soil. Look at the water just sitting there, and the vine roots will not perform in that heavy waterlogged soil. Here's another picture of the same vineyard, and you can see what a sorry sight that is for an 8-year-old vineyard. It never ever was productive, and the grower finally decided to stop wasting money. This is the same vineyard again that we showed you on our tour of the valley in video 41. And here we are, August 17th, and there's water after a rain sitting there in the middle of summer because of this poorly drained soil. So unfortunate to have spent all the money to try to establish a vineyard on this site. By contrast, I'm showing you some cuttings that were growing here for an experiment, and we put them in little pots with a very well-drained potting soil. And even as they start to grow like this early on, we get the development of wonderful roots in a well-drained soil mixture environment. And here it is. Here it is. Look at how nicely those root initials, as we call them, are protruding out of that cutting at the very, very start of growth of this cutting. Here it is more closely. boy, they are going to develop into a wonderful, massive root system as we put this rooted cutting out in the field. Oh, I put this picture in. This is a vineyard that may be 100 years old, and it has done well, and the grower has renewed the trunks to keep them healthy. And you can tell this vineyard is on really good soil. It is a gravelly loam soil, and you see the rocks here and there. That's a good indication that we have a soil that has a lot of sand and gravel and rock in it, and the roots penetrate down through that well-drained soil very nicely. So we're going to make the statement that grapevine root development determines a grapevine's capacity to produce a crop. And let me show you what I mean by that. Here is my fancy schematic drawing of a grapevine. Lots of roots in yellow below ground, nice development of shoots above ground. Everything looks wonderful. And this is what you would expect in a nice, well-drained, sandy loam soil, as we're suggesting exists here. Oh, you won't find this. You would never find this. You won't find a big development of the shoots above ground coming from a small root system as we have pictured here. I went to school for plant ecology for part of my education, and during that time I learned about root-shoot ratios. Do you know that there's a definite relationship between the amount of growth above ground of a plant and the amount of root development below? So you don't get something like this, a small root system and a large growth above ground. No. And you don't get this. You don't get a large root system that produces only a small amount of growth above ground. No, you get a balanced growth. The ratios may differ depending upon the situation and the type of plant, what species, what kind of plant. But there is a well-defined ratio between what's going on below ground and above ground. And you want in your vineyard, and you want to choose a vineyard site that has a soil complex that is going to allow for the development of a large, well-developed, well-distributed throughout the soil type of root system for your grapevines. Well, here's a picture of a Concord grape vineyard at the MSU Southwest Michigan Research and Extension Center, and we did a study several years ago where we were looking at the root systems in this vineyard, and we excavated extensively, and you can see on the picture on the right piles of sandy loam soil, and we dug big pits. And let's talk a little more about what we found. Well, this study was part of the master's thesis work for Mr. Randall Voss on the left there. And Randy did a beautiful job working on this project, and there were many aspects to it, but we're only going to mention one. As we dug up the soil, we sieved it through a gadget that I'm going to show you more closely with hardware cloth on it. Looks like this. And we would get all the roots from that soil volume, and then we could measure how many roots were at what depths and at what location from the base of the vine, etc. And here's a picture showing a cross section, and by and large most of the roots were in that top 1.5 feet, as you can see. Occasionally there were roots further down in the soil, but most of them were up in the top 18 inches or 45 centimeters of the soil profile. There's another picture of that same project, and see, we have the soil surface 18 inches down to the break between the A and the B horizon in the soil. And then we went down for a total of 36 inches or 90 centimeters. And what did we find? We found that 95% of the roots that we found were in the top 18 inches or 45 centimeters of the soil. 95%. There were very few roots that went down more than 18 inches or 45 centimeters. Well, let's continue the story by making the statement, internal soil drainage is influenced by many factors. They include soil texture, and by that we mean how much sand and silt and clay is in the mix of the soil. By impervious layers of soil will influence internal drainage. And sometimes we get a layer of soil that is very compacted and roots and water can almost not penetrate it. And that is called a fragipan by soil scientists. Topography. Sure, we get topography where we get water draining to a particular area and it doesn't escape from that area very well. We're going to have a waterlogged soil. So those things and others will influence the internal soil drainage. And the most direct way to assess the impact of all these factors on vine performance is simply to evaluate the soil internal drainage itself. Let's continue our story by reviewing a few facts about grapevine root distributions. Number 1. Grapevine roots can penetrate very deep in the soil. There are several reports of grapevine roots being found at 20 to 30 feet of soil depth. Wow, that's amazing. That's a very deep root system. Number 2. However, most grapevine roots are not found deep in the soil. Numerous studies worldwide, including the one that we just showed you with Randall Voss, suggest that 63% of the roots of a typical grapevine are found in the top 24 inches, or that is 60 centimeters of soil. Almost 2/3 of a typical grapevine root system is in the top 24 inches of soil. And B, 80% of the roots of a typical grapevine are found in the top 40 inches or 100 centimeters of soil. That's amazing. And most people think that grapevines are deep-rooted, and they are on occasion, but most of the working root system of a grapevine is going to be found in the upper layers of soil. And that's important to know. So therefore, if that's the case, if you evaluate the drainage characteristics of the top 40 inches or 100 centimeters of soil in a potential vineyard site, you will have a good idea of the worth of that site for a vineyard in regard to this very important soil internal drainage characteristic. How do you find out about that? Well, in the United States, there are many, many areas that have what we call a soil survey. This happens to be the cover of the soil survey of the county that I live in, Michigan. And many, many areas have this. This book is probably about 1.25 inches thick, and it has mapping that looks like this. You go across fields, and in great detail, those numbers, 12C and 35, they refer to different kinds of soil that were found in these locations. These were mapped out decades ago, and you may find that you have such a reference for your area, and that will help you begin evaluating the soil characteristics of a potential vineyard site. Well, of course, the most direct way is just dig it up. Dig up a test area where you're going to plant a vineyard and evaluate the soil for yourself. As we do that, we're going to show you a couple of things about this particular soil pit. This happens to be next to a woodlot, as you can see in the background. All right, here it is. We dug down about 3 feet or 40 inches, and we looked at that soil. And the first thing I would say is that, do you notice that most of the areas here are brownish or orangey colored? And that's because the iron in the soil has been oxidized. Iron oxide. What is iron oxide? Rust. Yes. So this rusty orange color says there's oxygen in that part of the soil profile. And that means that this soil is reasonably well drained to support the growth of roots. Now here, there's some grayishness. When you see that in a soil profile, that indicates that that's not so well drained, that iron in that area has not been oxidized, that it is not particularly suitable for root development. If you dug down in your soil and you found major areas that had a more grayish coloration rather than the orangey rust-colored color, that would begin to tell you this is not as good as I would have hoped. And you might need to do some things about that, or at least be aware that your soil is less than well drained. Now, many suitable vineyard sites could be improved through modification of soil internal drainage. Even if you have a site that is basically good, it may need some help before you plant the grapevines. Remember this schematic drawing? Here we have grapevine with nice root growth and distribution throughout a well-drained soil, nice growth on top. Well, what if we have a poorly drained soil? What if we dug a soil pit and we found that we went down and the water table was down 12, 15, 18 inches, and then it was just a waterlogged soil, as we're trying to suggest here? Well, the roots aren't going to penetrate that, and you're going to have the development of small root systems and in turn small vines. And you can do something about that if the problem is not too bad. Sometimes you might just as well say, nope, can't plant vines here. Sometimes you'd say, well, it's not too bad, and with some help we can modify this vineyard site before we plant the vines to make it a better vineyard site. And we do that with tiling, putting pipes, if you will, in the ground that will drain the water away from the vineyard, away from the vineyard site, as we're suggesting by this schematic. Here's a picture of tiling being done. You see that corrugated plastic tile, and in all of those corrugations there's cuts or slices so that the water can run into that pipe and be drained by gravity away from this site, and we have an improved soil for not just grapevines but for lots of crops. And it typically is led to a low spot on the edge of the field, and it will come out of those tiles like this. Here is a picture in the Finger Lakes region of New York State, and the tractor over on the right side there is tiling that depression in this field early in the spring prior to the planting of this site to vineyard. The posts on the left are a vineyard that was planted the previous year, and the planting is going to continue downslope here. But first, the grower knows that this is his one chance to alter the internal drainage of this site before the vines get planted. Well, here's a picture of a subsoiler plow with a single blade on it. And even with this small tractor, we can push that down in the soil about 2 feet. You can see where it's rusty, and work up the soil right where we're going to plant the grapevines. Or if you have the wherewithal, you can use a multi-tooth subsoiler and rip up the whole soil mass of a soil that could stand some additional internal drainage. So here we are looking from the tractor seat back over the PTO, and there is that single-bladed subsoiler plow, and we're going to run it through the soil to create a trench of increased soil drainage right where we're going to put the vines. And here's what it looked like after we did that. Alright, here's where we did subsoiling in these rows the year before we planted, which was the previous year, and this is vines in their second year. And right here, going over to the left, is where we did not subsoil. What a difference, huh? Wow. That's how important and how dramatic internal drainage of the soil can be to the development of your grapevines. So look for well-drained soils to begin with, and if they're not perfectly well-drained, consider doing something about increasing the internal drainage of the soils before you plant. Well, here's another trick, if you will, that will help if you've planted on a poorly drained soil and you can't find your way with resources to do tiling down the rows or across the rows. At least you can do this. You can create berms under the trellis that may help in extremely wet areas. And how does that help? Because it at least creates a small volume of soil right around the vine that is drained just because of the berming, creating those berms of soil. There's another picture of that. And that will help. That's remedial. You know what that means? You make up for a problem you created, and at least you do something to try to improve the condition of that soil in a wet, waterlogged area where you already planted vines. And here it is from the ground surface view. So if you've made the mistake of planting on heavy, waterlogged soil, and you're going to force yourself to continue managing that vineyard, then try this. Now, previously we said that soil chemistry is not the most important factor in a vineyard soil, but it is important. It's very important. And there are two fundamental reasons for obtaining a soil test prior to planting grapevines. The first of those is to determine the soil pH for possible modification prior to planting. Let's talk about this. Grapevines often grow well over a middle range of soil pH from 5.5 to 7.0. Soil pH values above and below that range can be a problem. For example, this is a condition known as Sauerschaden, which means sour harm or sour disease in German. And it's a leaf disorder associated with soil pH levels of 4.5 or less. So if we get pH levels down that low, we need to do something about it. I haven't had to deal with high lime soils, but high pHs have their own set of problems. So we're trying to avoid very low and very high pHs when we plant a vineyard. So the optimum vineyard soil pH value depends on the varieties being grown. In the Michigan area that I'm familiar with, we grow 3 different types of grapevines, if you will. And we have native varieties such as Concord and Niagara, Delaware, and we recommend that they be grown at a pH from 5.5 to 6. And hybrids of all kinds, whether they be what we would call French-American hybrids or hybrids from more recent breeding programs in various locations, the pH there, the optimum would be around 6 to 6.5, whereas for vinifera varieties, we typically recommend 6.5 to 7. And so your best chance of making a modification of soil pH is before you plant, because you're going to put tons of lime per acre on a vineyard site and then plow it in as deep as you can, because if you just spread it on the surface, it's going to take years and years and years for that lime to have any effect. So you really want to make your soil pH modification before you plant the vines, and you need to take a soil test while you're in the process of site selection to see what is the pH of this soil. How much work is it going to take to get this vineyard site to a proper soil pH for the types of vines I'm planting. For example, we have this chart here that says depending upon the soil type, if the initial pH is outlined in yellow, we're 4.5. It could take, depending upon the type of soil, the texture of the soil, it could take anywhere from 2 to 4 tons of lime to bring that up to a pH of 6. Now you may want to bring it up to 6.5 or 7. That takes even more. But I just put this in here as an illustration of, yes, take a soil test when you're evaluating a vineyard site and look at the soil pH as a significant factor that might need some work, and it might need a lot of work to get the vineyard site properly prepared for your new vineyard. I put this in, this is called the relative cation, that means positive ions in the soil absorption strength. And what we're trying to say by this is that from the left to the right, the strength of aluminum here and then calcium is indicated here. Those will adhere to soil particles, clay, or organic matter stronger than those as you go to the right. So I put this in because I want to sensitize you that don't go overboard with liming, because one of our very important nutrients for vineyards is potassium. And if you get carried away with excess liming, you can have those calcium cations flush out the potassium because it will bond more strongly to the clay and organic matter in the soil than potassium. And that condition can be called lime-induced potassium deficiency. So get a soil test and properly adjust your soil pH, and don't go overboard with the lime. Well, we said that there are 2 fundamental reasons for obtaining a soil test prior to planting grapevines. One has to do with the soil pH we were just talking about. The second reason is to determine the soil potassium level for possible modification after planting. Let's talk about it. If soil potassium is below 200 pounds per acre, then we'll want to apply potassium fertilizer by banding it along the vine rows right after planting. according to the following table. And here you have it. Now, why do we say wait and apply it after planting, and why band it along the rows? Because potassium is tied up in the soil fairly easily. There's a lot of potassium in soils that's unavailable for plant growth. And if we just broadcast the potassium fertilizers across the whole field, most of it will be uselessly lost, either leached out because it's nowhere near the root zone of the vines, or it will be irretrievably bound to clay particles. So if we're going to make maximum use of your fertilizer dollar, you're going to want to get a soil test, determine if you have a quite low level of potassium, and if so, ban some potassium fertilizer along the vine rows after planting to put it right in the root zone of the vine. Now, there are many nutrients other than potassium that are very important to vine performance. Nitrogen, for example, is typically the most important nutrient for vine performance. Not always, but often. Other nutrients, to include magnesium, manganese, iron, boron, and zinc, are occasionally deficient in vineyards. These nutrients are not a factor when evaluating a potential vineyard site. They can be a factor as we develop the vineyard, and we may need to take corrective measures for these and maybe other nutrients, but we don't need to bother our thinking when we're picking out a vineyard site with all the nutrients in the soil, just pH and potassium. These nutrients will be discussed later in videos on vineyard nutrition. Alright, here's a lovely summer's day in southwest Michigan, and we have this 5-acre, or that's about 2 hectares, planting of Concord grapevines. And here is the top of the slope where those vines are planted, and here is the bottom. And the distance between the top and bottom of this vineyard is about 450 feet or 135 meters. And we're going to see how important that difference is from the top to the bottom of that vineyard. Alright, so here's a table of all kinds of numbers. Wow. Let's settle back and see if we can make some sense out of this. At the location that says the top of the vineyard, we have a row of data that is right along here. And then below that, we have at the bottom of the vineyard, down the slope, we have another row of data called the bottom. And then we have this column of data that we are calling the difference. Well, the pH of a soil is in a logarithmic expression. So if we put a percentage here, it would be over 1,000%. So we're not going to talk about it in percentage terms, but the difference between 5.7 and 6.9 is quite large. Then if we look at the other aspects of the soil between the top and the bottom of this vineyard, we see that there's at least a 48% difference in the potassium here, and at the high end there's a 315% difference in the magnesium level here, and all the other numbers in between. And why do we say all this? Because when you take a soil test to evaluate your vineyard site and to make modifications in pH or getting ready to put on potassium, look critically at how different your site is from one end to the other, from the top of the hill to the bottom, and you may need to take more than one soil sample and consider parts of the vineyard as separate entities, because one soil sample trying to evaluate a 5-acre, 2-hectare planting or larger may lead you to the wrong conclusion. And we're just going to leave it at that. There you go. Look at those numbers. Large percentage differences across all things from top to bottom. Soil water holding capacity. I have to admit to you that I don't consider this in choosing a vineyard site very often, and it's because of where I live. In southwest Michigan, here are 5 years of data showing the precipitation through the summer months. And you can see that we have a lot of precipitation in all of the months that we grow grapevines. On average, we have about 3 inches of precipitation every month of the growing season. So irrigation issues, and that combined with the type of soils we have, doesn't make water holding capacity an important factor for us. But it might be for you. And you might want to look at, when you plant your vineyard on a particular site, how droughty is it? How much of an issue is that soil going to be for growing the vines through the growing season without their incurring drought stress? Here's a picture of a new vineyard, and you can see in the foreground trickle irrigation tape that we've put in some of the rows, and we routinely benefit highly from irrigation of newly planted grapevines. It is really, really helpful in the formative years, the first 2 years of a vineyard. But when the vineyard gets mature, we don't see the benefit to keep up that irrigation for our type of conditions. But you may want to consider this factor if you're in a very drought-prone climate and you have very well-drained soils. Now, vineyard soil biotic factors. That means living things in the soil, such as little microscopic worms called nematodes. And some nematodes are really destructive on root systems of grapevines. And they can also be the vectors or the carriers of virus diseases, of some of our major virus diseases. So, depending again on your situation, you may need to look into the nematode condition in your soils. We often do not do that, but I just put it in here to complete the story of soil for vineyard site selection. Now, if your site that you're considering for your new vineyard is a vineyard replant, that is to say, if you're thinking of coming in and planting a new vineyard where there has been a vineyard previously that was taken out, well, then you may have several types of carryover problems. And here they are: crown gall disease, viruses of various kinds, and the root pest phylloxera for 3. So you'll want to take that into account when you select a site that has previously been planted to vineyard. And oftentimes you're going to want to fallow that site for a minimum of 2 years after the vines, the old vines, were taken out, and as much of the old parts of the vines and root systems were taken out before you replant, if you have that opportunity. Well, that's it, folks. That's what we think about the importance of soil for vineyard site selection. It's very, very important. We hope this information will be useful to you. In our next video, we're going to talk to those of you who are not interested in planting acres and acres of vineyards, but you want to plant a few vines in your backyard. So we're going to look at site selection in the backyard. and some factors about that. But for now, we'll just say happy grape growing.